There is a worrying rise in teenage pregnancies in South Africa. According to a recent report, over 45,000 births were registered to mothers aged 17 and younger, and 42 of these births were to girls aged between 11 and 12 years. KZN Health MEC sharing her concerns over these figures and saying that families should lay charges against men who impregnate young girls. Let's bring in GBV organization, the Tears Foundation, who's also been vocal on this issue. Mara Glennie is the founder and director, and she joins us via our video link this morning. Mara, it's great to talk to you. Thanks very much for coming on. I mean, on the face of it, what do you make of these numbers? I suppose let's begin with the more shocking of the two figures we've given. Those 42 births registered to girls aged between 11 and 12.
Well, thank you for asking the question. I think it's very valid. I think that those are figures only for KZN, because the figure I have is that 90,000 live births took place to children between 10 and 19 years old. So I think those are only for KwaZulu-Natal. It is a very, very real problem. And in fact, there are very frequently of a young age. I recently had a case of an 11-year-old who was sent into hospital with stomach pains because she hadn't even started menstruating, but she had menstruated and become pregnant, raped by a cousin in the village, and no one knew she was pregnant. Her body actually went into a coma. So the reason I'm bringing that up is that the younger the girl is when she falls pregnant, the more threat is it to her life and to the life of the newborn. So training children about gender-based violence and rape and abuse is very, very important.
So Mara, just to get those numbers right again, you said the number that you have is over 90,000 in South Africa.
Yes. And it's been published.
And that's for girls aged between 10 and 19, you said?
Correct. And then I wanted to stress that we talk about live births. In the past few years, I've come to understand that we only hear about births that happen within hospitals. Quite often births happen within homes, or the babies are dumped straight after birth. So we work with some of the police stations, and babies are put into packets and left with the rubbish, or where near the place nearby where our office is, we often get calls because babies have been thrown into the Yukske, because we don't have. So my difficulty is that one must realize the problem isn't that children are having babies so early. The problem is that before they have the baby, we are failing them. So if you are a young girl who's pregnant, there's no place for you to go. There's a handful of places. So what do you do if you live in a two-roomed home with maybe one breadwinner and you're pregnant? What do you do? So I think we should be careful not to, whilst the situation is very dire, I think we should start with why is it happening? You know, as we sit here now, and you can Google it, we don't have condoms to give our youth because the clinics have run out of condoms, and quite a few of them have run out of birth control pills, both of which, according to our constitution and our laws, the youth are able to get from a very early age, 11. So they can't get condoms, they can't get birth control pills. What's going to happen in 9 months' time after this Christmas thing? That figure is going to be low. So we really need to take a moment as adults and realize that we are not doing our children any favor whatsoever by not teaching about sex and how to not fall pregnant.
Yeah. I mean, you talk about how we're failing our young girls, Mara, and you asked the question about if you are a young girl of this age, between 10 and 19, it's so painfully young. And if you do fall pregnant, I mean, what is the answer to that question? Where do I go?
It is a riddle to everybody, I'm afraid to say. So we have a service. In fact, we're launching, we have it on trial at the moment, and it will be launched full stream in January, called Speak Up, because we just felt that a lot of children don't eat. So we talk about the pregnancy, and as adults we understand the process, but most children don't even understand, because they have not been taught that the cycle of menstruation is related to sex or babies or whatever place you want to lock into the system. So we have to start teaching our children the absolute very fundamentals. So we teach them about things like a lack of sanitary towels, but not what the consequence of not having your menstruation is. So it's a very big difference. And answer to your question, there are very, very few places that are open to them.
Yeah.
So I recently met with a person who had been to a funeral, and he was in tears. He's one of my work colleagues. And he said he'd just been to a funeral with a young girl from an affluent family, not living in a shelter, had given birth to a dead baby, because when she discovered she was pregnant, she was too scared to tell anybody, so she started binding herself until eventually the baby didn't grow anymore and it was dead. And then because I was naive like all of us, and I'm sure all of you watching me, and I found out that's a very common thing, because we don't have a place for the children to go. And answer to your question, there is no home for unmarried mother. There's the odd scattering. We as a community, as South Africans, are ignoring that it's a very real problem, in the same ways that we ignore that there are not enough shelters for rape victims, and even worse, you're only allowed to stay 3 months in the shelter. So I guess that the number of children with babies should be a wake-up call for us, that we need to sexually protect the women of our country. If they've been abused, they need a place to stay. If they're pregnant, they need a place to stay. It is not there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the risk to the young mother's life, you've already outlined that for us, Mara. And then, of course, it's the babies that come from these young births. As you say, in some cases, the babies are dumped. In other cases, they are stillbirths. But in cases where the babies are born, you know, in your experience, what happens?
Well, often they're undernourished, and they have to go onto incubators. And so I read with alarm, because obviously it is a passion very close to my heart. I read with alarm in the newspaper a few weeks back, maybe 3, that there was an outcry at the number of babies that were abandoned in hospitals. And then I looked at it and I thought, but actually those mothers care about their babies. And you might say, well, how can you say that? They've left their baby at the hospital. So I'm saying they chose to safely deliver their baby and leave it in a place where the baby will be fed, because economically young girls don't have the wherewithal, financially or other, to cope with the feeding of a baby in these difficult times. So it is a huge problem that we're facing as a country. So many times those babies have to have feeding, and I don't mean bottle feeding, I mean intravenous feeding, because they are malnourished. So we sit with a population of young girls whose bodies are not mature enough to withstand breastfeeding, or even haven't been taking the correct vitamins, are ill prepared for birth.
Yeah. So Mara, there are a number of discussions, as you say. It's an issue that has so many different facets to it. One of those issues is, of course, that these births are linked to abuse, are linked to relationships with older men. But in some cases, Mara, and it comes back to your point around sex education for our young people, these are boys and girls of the same age that are exploring each other's bodies, and it results in pregnancy. And that's where sex education, as you say, the importance of knowing, you know, what your period means, what menstruation means, and how babies come about.
It's absolutely vital. When I've given talks in schools, the parents have to sign a permission form so that they can hear about sex, and often they refuse that. And so when I queried some of them, obviously I have no say over it. If only 10 of the class are allowed to listen, then that's 10. But when querying why, because if they learn about sex, they'll want to try it. So we really have to break the old cultural taboos. And we have to understand that if you've not taught a child about consent, in fact, that's our very first program we start talking about is what is consent. Because whether it's that you have an older man in your life who's your sugar daddy, or whether it is your cousin and you're playing doctor, and any other parameter, the understanding of the consequence of your actions is just not there. So when they go to the clinic, which is quite often their nearest, they are met with a lot of criticism. And so we need to make talking about sex an open subject in our homes. So to all the moms and dads who are watching us out there today, have that birds and bees talk. Tell them about the real stuff, because that will help us with the unacceptably high rate of childbirth, because the children cannot cope with them.
Absolutely. Mara Glennie, let me thank you for your time this morning. Such an incredibly important discussion. Mara is the founder and director of the Tears Foundation.